They had
husband's
already
blood is
decided
on your
she was
hands.
guilty
I
before she
did what
even
I had to
opened her
do for
mouth.
the village.
The words
He was
drifted
innocent.
through
You
red
took
hollow
him from
like
me. The
dust
village
and
would have
dry
starved.
wind,
I had no choice.
settling into every
Curse
crack,
you.
every doorway,
Please, I didn't
every
do
quiet
it.
place where doubt should have
I'm
lived but
charging
didn't.
so
By the
many
time
crimes.
the sun climbed
law
halfway
is the
over
law.
the grain silos,
No, this
Clara
isn't
Whitlock
right.
was no longer a widow who kept to herself on the edge of town. She was a story people told each other to make sense of something they didn't understand. No one could point to when it started, just that it did. Like most dangerous things out here, a missing child, a scrap of cloth caught on river reeds, and suddenly the town needed an answer more than it needed the truth. Clara stood near the center of it all, her hands still, her shoulders straight, though the air around her felt heavy, like a storm that hadn't decided whether to break or pass. Boots shuffled in the dirt, low voices stacked on top of one another, each man and woman adding their certainty to the pile until it felt too large to question. Someone said her name like it meant something different now, something colder, and others repeated it until it stuck. The sheriff stood a few feet away, hat low, eyes careful, as if trying to balance something that had already tipped. Clara didn't speak, not because she had nothing to say, but because she could feel it in the way they looked at her, the way they stood just a little farther back than they used to, that her words wouldn't land anywhere that mattered. Out here, silence wasn't always peace. Sometimes it was a verdict. The wind pushed through the main street, carrying the smell of dry wood and iron, brushing past faces that refused to soften. No one noticed the man at the edge of the crowd at first. Not really, because Ethan Cole had a way of being there without taking space, like a fence post that had been standing so long people forgot it was placed there by someone's hand. He stood with his hat low, shoulders squared, not tense, not relaxed, just present. He had ridden in before sunrise, tied his horse outside the general store, and said nothing to anyone, same as always. But now his eyes were fixed on Clara, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with something quieter, something harder to name. The kind of look a man gives when he's measuring more than what's in front of him. Someone in the crowd shifted, glancing his way, then back again, unsure why it mattered. The sheriff cleared his throat, stepping forward, saying words that sounded like procedure, like order, like something meant to keep things from unraveling. But the truth was already slipping through their fingers. Clara lifted her gaze just slightly, enough to meet the line of people in front of her, and for a second, just one, there was something there that didn't belong to fear or shame, something steadier, like she had already accepted a weight no one else understood. And that's when Ethan moved, not fast, not loud, just one step forward, the kind of step that doesn't ask permission. The dust shifted under his boot, the sound small but clear, and suddenly it was the only thing anyone heard. He didn't speak, didn't reach for anything, didn't look at the sheriff or the crowd, just took that place a few feet closer, as if drawing a line no one else could see yet. The kind of line that doesn't exist until someone refuses to cross it. The space between Ethan Cole and the rest of the town felt wider than the 12 feet that separated them. Like something invisible had been placed there, something no one quite understood but no one wanted to test. The sheriff shifted his weight, boots grinding softly against the packed dirt, his hand resting near his belt, not out of threat but out of habit, the kind of habit a man leans on when the ground under him does not feel steady. Clara Whitlock did not move, but her breathing slowed, just enough to notice if you were looking for it, just enough to suggest she had seen something change the moment Ethan stepped forward. A murmur rolled through the crowd, low and uncertain, not the sharp edge of accusation from before, but something softer, like doubt trying to find its way back in. People glanced at one another, searching for agreement they could no longer feel as easily, and finding only hesitation. Someone near the back spoke up, voice louder than it needed to be, repeating what they had all said earlier, about the missing child, about the cloth by the river, about how things add up if you let them. But the words did not land the same way this time. They hung in the air, thinner, like they had lost weight. Ethan kept his eyes forward, not challenging, not pleading, just steady, as if he had decided something long before he ever walked into that street. The sheriff took a slow step closer, lowering his voice, speaking directly to him now, telling him this was not his concern, that order had to be kept, that the town could not afford doubt when a child was involved. Ethan listened without nodding, without shaking his head, And when the sheriff finished, the silence that followed felt heavier than the words themselves. A loose board creaked somewhere along the storefront, the wind pressing against it in small, persistent taps, like a reminder that not everything yields just because it is told to. Clara's eyes shifted, not to the crowd, not to the sheriff, but to Ethan, studying him in a way that suggested she was trying to understand why a man who owed her nothing had chosen this moment to stand where others would not. There was no gratitude in her expression, not yet, only a quiet question, one that did not ask for an answer but existed all the same. Farther down the street, an old man removed his hat, not in respect, not exactly, but as if something in him had loosened and he did not know what to do with his hands. A woman beside him lowered her gaze, the certainty she carried minutes ago slipping just enough to make her uncomfortable. The sheriff exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the open air, and for the first time since the morning began, he looked past Clara, past the crowd, and out toward the road that led north, as if hoping for something, anything, to arrive and settle what he could not. But nothing came, only the same long stretch of land under a pale sky, waiting. Ethan shifted his stance by an inch, just enough to plant himself more firmly, and it was a small movement, barely worth noticing, except everyone noticed, because it was not the step forward that held them, it was the refusal to step back, and in that refusal, something began to crack, not loud, not sudden, but deep enough that even those who did not understand it could feel that whatever happened next would not follow the path they had already chosen. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like a long rope pulled too tight, beginning to loosen strand by strand. And the first to move was not Ethan, not Clara, but the people who had been so certain just minutes ago. A man near the front cleared his throat and looked down at his boots, as if something there demanded his attention more than the woman he had been accusing, while another stepped half a pace back without realizing he had done it, creating a gap that had not existed before. The sheriff noticed it too. The way the line he thought he was holding together had begun to bend, and he drew in a slow breath, eyes narrowing not in anger but in calculation, weighing what could still be controlled against what had already slipped beyond him. Clara Whitlock remained still, yet something in her posture changed, not defiance, not relief, but a quiet reclaiming of space that had been taken from her without permission. She lifted her chin just slightly, enough to meet the eyes of those who still dared to look, and in that small movement there was a steadiness that did not ask for belief, only for time. Ethan Cole did not turn, did not acknowledge the shifting crowd behind him, but he felt it, the way a man feels weather before it arrives, subtle and undeniable. The wind carried the faint creak of a sign swinging above the general store, back and forth, marking seconds that seemed longer than they should have been. Then a sound came from beyond the edge of town, distant at first, almost mistaken for the wind itself, but steady, rhythmic, the unmistakable cadence of hooves on hard ground. Heads turned one by one, attention pulled away from Clara, from Ethan, from the fragile line that had formed between them, toward the northern road where the land stretched open and unbroken. A figure appeared against the horizon, small at first, then growing as the horse carried its rider closer, dust trailing behind like a quiet announcement. The sheriff straightened, something like hope flickering across his face, because this was the kind of interruption a man in his position could lean on, something external, something that could decide for him. The rider did not slow until reaching the edge of the gathered crowd, pulling the horse to a stop with a soft command, breath visible in the cooler shade of the buildings. He looked from face to face, confusion lining his features as he took in the tension that still hung in the air. "What is going on here?" he asked, voice carrying just enough to reach the center of the street, and no one answered right away. Clara's eyes moved to him, searching, while the sheriff stepped forward, ready to speak, ready to shape the story before it could be told another way. But Ethan finally shifted his gaze, not toward the sheriff, not toward the crowd, but toward the rider, as if he had been waiting for something exactly like this. And in that moment, the balance of the entire street seemed to rest not on what had already been said, but on what this one man had come to say next. The rider's question lingered in the air longer than it should have, as if the town itself did not know how to answer without exposing something it could not take back. The sheriff stepped forward first, boots measured, voice steady in the way a man practices when he needs control more than truth, explaining just enough to frame the moment without inviting doubt, speaking of a missing child, of concern, of necessary action, each word placed carefully like stones meant to hold a shifting ground. The rider listened without interrupting, his brow tightening not in anger, but in quiet confusion, the kind that comes when a story does not sit right even before all of it is told. Clara Whitlock stood where she had been left, but now the distance between her and the others felt different, less like a wall and more like a space waiting to be crossed back. Ethan Cole remained between her and the crowd, not blocking, not threatening, simply existing in a way that made movement around him feel deliberate rather than automatic. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at coats and loose fabric, carrying with it the faint scent of river water from beyond. The ridge, a reminder that whatever had begun this was still out there, unchanged by what the town had decided. The rider swung one leg over and dismounted slowly, boots touching the ground with a soft thud that seemed louder than it was, his hand resting briefly on the saddle as he looked again from the sheriff to Clara, then to Ethan, measuring something he could not yet name. "You said the child is missing," he repeated, not as a question, but as a point that needed to be held in place. And when the sheriff nodded, the rider's gaze shifted toward the north road again, as if replaying the miles behind him. A pause followed, long enough for the crowd to lean forward without realizing it, long enough for doubt to grow roots where certainty had stood. "I passed a boy about 2 miles out," the rider said finally, his voice calm, almost casual, yet it cut through the air cleaner than anything spoken that morning. The words did not land all at once. They moved through the crowd in waves. First confusion, then disbelief, then something heavier that no one wanted to name. The sheriff's posture stiffened, just slightly, his eyes narrowing as if trying to find a place where this new piece of truth could fit without undoing everything already set in motion. Clara's breath caught, barely visible, but there, and for the first time since she had been brought into the street, her shoulders eased by a fraction of an inch. Ethan did not react outwardly, but his stance shifted again, not forward, not back, just enough to show he had heard, that he had been right to wait. A man near the front lowered his gaze completely now, the weight of his earlier certainty settling into something that looked uncomfortably like regret. No one spoke right away, because there are moments when words do not help, when they only reveal too much. The rider glanced at the faces around him, reading them one by one, understanding more from what was not said than what had been, and in that quiet, the town of Red Hollow felt smaller than it had that morning, not in size, but in the space left between who they thought they were and what they had almost done. No one moved at first, not because they could, not, but because movement now meant admitting something had gone wrong, and that was a heavier thing to carry than any accusation they had thrown minutes before. The rider's words settled into the ground like a truth that could not be pushed aside, and slowly, almost carefully, the shape of the crowd began to change. A man near the center stepped back fully this time, creating space where there had been pressure, and others followed without looking at one another, as if guided by the same quiet understanding they could not yet say out loud. The sheriff remained where he stood, but his shoulders lowered just slightly, the weight of command slipping into something more uncertain, more human. He glanced at Clara Whitlock, not as a suspect now, but as someone he had nearly misjudged in front of an entire town, and the realization did not sit well. Clara did not speak, did not demand anything, and that made it harder. Because silence leaves room for conscience to grow, Ethan Cole finally shifted his gaze, not toward the crowd, not toward the sheriff, but toward Clara, and for a brief moment their eyes met without words, without acknowledgement, just a quiet passing of something that did not need to be named. The wind moved again, softer this time, brushing across the street as if clearing what had been stirred up. Somewhere a door creaked open, then closed again, small sounds returning to a place that had been too loud with certainty. The rider took a step forward, leading his horse gently by the reins, adding more detail now, speaking of the boy he had seen sitting by the creek bend, unharmed, waiting, unaware of the storm his absence had created behind him. Each word he spoke pulled another layer away from the story the town had built, leaving behind something thinner, something fragile, A woman near the back pressed her hand to her mouth, her earlier confidence dissolving into something quieter, something closer to shame. No one looked at Clara directly now, not because they did not see her, but because they saw too clearly. The sheriff removed his hat slowly, running a hand along the brim as if searching for the right thing to say and finding nothing that would not sound smaller than the moment required. He turned slightly toward Clara, his voice lower than before, carrying less authority and more weight, beginning a sentence that did not quite reach the end, because some apologies cannot be formed fast enough to matter. Clara gave a small nod, not accepting, not rejecting, simply acknowledging that something had shifted, and that was enough for now. Ethan stepped back then, just one pace, not retreating, but releasing the line he had held, allowing the space between them all to return to something closer to normal. But it was not the same space as before. It could not be. The town of Red Hollow stood there, quieter than it had ever been. Each person holding a piece of what had almost happened, and understanding in their own way that it would stay with them longer than anything they had said that morning. The crowd did not disappear all at once. It unraveled, thread by thread, person by person, each step away quieter than the last, as if the ground itself might remember where they had stood, boots turned, shoulders angled. Conversations that had once been loud with certainty now reduced to low murmurs that carried no conviction, only the need to say something that might soften what had already been done. Clara Whitlock remained where she was for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but because leaving too quickly would have felt like surrendering something she had just taken back without asking. The sheriff stepped aside, not as an order, not as a gesture, but simply because there was no longer a reason to stand in her way, and that small movement said more than any words he could have found. Ethan Cole watched the space open, the same way he had watched it close, without urgency, without relief, just a quiet acknowledgement that the line he had held was no longer needed. Clara walked past him then, her steps even, her gaze forward, not seeking anyone, not avoiding anyone, just moving through the town that had nearly forgotten who she was. For a brief second, as she passed, she slowed, not enough for others to notice, but enough that Ethan did, and she inclined her head by the smallest degree, a gesture that carried no debt, no obligation, only recognition. Ethan did not respond, not outwardly, but his stance eased, the tension leaving his shoulders the way a storm leaves the sky, gradually, without announcement. The rider remained near his horse, watching it all with a look that suggested he had seen many towns, many moments, but still found something in this one that stayed with him longer than expected. The sheriff lingered in the center of the street, hat still in his hands, turning it once, twice, as if it might offer him something to hold on to, then finally placing it back on his head with a motion that felt heavier than before. He glanced toward Ethan, their eyes meeting for the first time since the silence had settled, and though no words were exchanged, there was an understanding there, not agreement, not friendship, but the recognition of a line that had been drawn and not crossed. The wind carried a softer sound now, the creak of wood, the distant call of someone down the road, life returning in small, careful pieces. But something remained, something that would not leave with the dust or the passing of hours, something each person would carry differently. A man paused at the edge of the street and looked back once, just once, at the place where Clara had stood, then lowered his gaze and kept walking. A woman closed her door more gently than before, as if noise itself felt wrong. Ethan turned at last, stepping away from the center, his boots leaving faint prints that would fade by evening. But the memory of where he had stood would not, and though no one said it, though no one would likely speak of it again in the same way, there was a quiet understanding settling over Red Hollow, that the next time a voice rose too quickly, the next time certainty came too easy, they would remember not the crowd, not the fear, but the man who did not move. And the space that silence created when someone chose to stand inside it. The town did not return to normal that afternoon, not the way it had been before, because something invisible had shifted beneath the surface, something no one could sweep away with routine or bring. Clara Whitlock reached the edge of her property just as the sun began to lean west, the light stretching long across the dry grass. Touching the worn fence post she had repaired herself more times than she could count. She paused there, one hand resting lightly against the wood, feeling its roughness, its steadiness, as if grounding herself in something that did not change with the opinions of others. The house behind her stood quiet, unchanged, yet it felt different now, not because of what had happened, but because she had walked back to it without lowering her eyes. Inside the town, doors closed a little softer, voices stayed lower, and the usual rhythm of the afternoon carried a hesitation that had not been there before. The sheriff sat alone on the wooden bench outside his office, hat tipped forward, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the dust his own boots had stirred earlier, as if searching for the exact moment things had gone too far. He replayed it in pieces, the voices, the looks, the way it had all felt. So certain, and how quickly certainty had turned into something else entirely. He did not like the feeling, not because it made him weak, but because it made him aware. Ethan Cole had already left the main street by then, walking his horse along the outer path that curved past the last few buildings before opening into land that did not belong to anyone but those willing to work it. He did not hurry, did not look back, because he understood something most men in town were only beginning to feel. That moments like the one they had just lived through do not end when the crowd disperses. They settle, they linger, they wait. The rider remained near the general store longer than expected, exchanging a few quiet words with those who approached him. Each conversation brief, each one carrying the same tone, a mixture of curiosity and something harder to name. No one asked him why he had spoken when he did, and he did not offer it. Across the street, the old man who had removed his hat earlier stood by the water trough, staring into it as if the reflection might show him something clearer than memory, but the surface only gave back what was already there. A young boy ran past, laughing at something unseen, the sound bright and out of place, reminding anyone who heard it that life continued whether they deserved that grace or not. Clara stepped inside her house as the light shifted again, closing the door behind her not with force, not with fear, but with intention, and for the first time that day, the silence she found inside belonged to her. Back on the road, Ethan mounted his horse, pausing just once to look out over the stretch of land ahead, wide and open, the kind of space where a man could think without interruption. And though his expression did not change, there was something settled in the way he held the reins, something that suggested he knew the town behind him would carry this longer than they admitted. Because out there, far from the center of Red Hollow, the dust would forget his footprints by morning, but the people would not forget where he had stood, and more importantly, why morning came slower over Red Hollow the next day, as if the sun itself had paused at the horizon to consider what it was rising over. And when the light finally reached the wooden facades and narrow street, it revealed a town that looked the same but carried something quieter beneath the surface. The usual sounds returned in pieces, the clink of metal from the blacksmith, the low murmur from the general store, boots against dry ground, but each sound seemed measured, as if people were listening to themselves in a way they had not before. Clara Whitlock stepped out onto her porch with a tin cup in her hand, the steam rising faint in the cool air, her eyes scanning the familiar stretch of land beyond her fence. And for the first time in a long while, she did not feel the need to look over her shoulder. The events of the day before had not changed who she was, but they had changed how she stood within it, and that difference settled into her movements, into the way she held the cup, into the quiet rhythm of her breath. Inside town, the sheriff unlocked his office door earlier than usual, the sound of the key turning echoing slightly in the empty street, and he paused before stepping in, glancing once toward the center where everything had unfolded, as if expecting to see something left behind. But there was nothing there except the memory, and that seemed heavier than anything physical could have been. He stepped inside without speaking, closing the door gently behind him. Near the edge of town, the rider prepared to leave, tightening the straps on his saddle with careful hands, his horse shifting slightly beneath him, ready for the miles ahead. A few townsfolk lingered nearby, not close enough to interrupt, but close enough to watch, as if they hoped to understand something about the man who had arrived at the right moment without knowing he would. He said little, offering only brief nods, his presence already fading into the road that called him forward. A boy ran past him toward the north path, the same direction the rider had come from the day before, and though no one stopped him, several eyes followed, a silent reassurance that this time, someone would be noticed before a story could take shape without truth. Farther out, beyond the last line of buildings, Ethan Cole guided his horse along the ridge that overlooked the town, the distance giving him a view not just of the land, but of the place where he had stood, now empty, now ordinary again. He paused there, reins loose in his hand, the wind brushing past him with the same steady patience it always had, and for a moment, he let himself look, not at the people, not at the buildings, but at the space itself, the space that had held something fragile and real. He did not stay long, because he understood that what mattered was not the place, but the choice that had been made within it. As he turned his horse and rode on, the town behind him continued its quiet return, but not entirely to what it had been. A man in the street stepped aside to let another pass without needing to. A woman offered a small nod where she might have once looked away, and though no one spoke of the day before, it lingered in the spaces between them, because sometimes change does not arrive with noise or force. Sometimes it comes in the form of a man who refuses to move and leaves behind a silence that teaches others how to listen. By the third day, Red Hollow had begun to speak. Again, but not in the same way, not with the same ease that once filled its narrow street. Conversations paused longer between sentences, eyes lingered a second too late, or looked away a second too soon. And though the words themselves sounded ordinary, something beneath them had shifted, like a foundation that had settled after a long strain. Clara Whitlock moved through her morning with the same quiet routine she had always kept, drawing water from the well, mending a loose board along her fence, tending to the small patch of land that gave her just enough to get by. But now when she walked the short distance toward town, the path did not feel as narrow as it once had. People noticed her sooner, not with the sharp curiosity that once followed her, but with a kind of awareness that came from remembering something they could not undo. A man tipped his hat, awkwardly, as if unsure whether the gesture was welcome, and Clara returned a small nod, not warm, not distant, simply acknowledging the moment for what it was. Inside the general store, the usual sounds of trade continued, coins on wood, goods shifting across the counter, but when Clara stepped in, the room did not fall silent. It adjusted, voices lowering just enough to make space without drawing attention to it. The shopkeeper met her eyes directly, something he had not always done, and asked what she needed in a tone that carried no hesitation. Clara answered plainly, her voice steady, as if nothing had changed, though everything had. Outside, the sheriff stood near the hitching post, speaking with a ranch hand about a broken fence line several miles east, the conversation practical, grounded, the kind of thing that kept a man focused on what he could fix. But when Clara passed by, his words slowed, then stopped, and he turned slightly, removing his hat once more, this time without thinking, the motion coming from somewhere deeper than duty. He did not try to explain, did not offer an apology. Shaped by careful words, he simply held the silence between them for a moment, and Clara gave the same small nod she had given before, accepting not the man, not the moment, but the effort. Farther down the road, a group of men who had stood at the front of the crowd days earlier worked together to lift a fallen beam outside the livery, their movements coordinated, their voices low, each one aware of the others in a way that had not been necessary before. No one mentioned what had happened, but it lived there, in the way they paused to listen when someone spoke, in the way no one rushed to finish another man's thought. Out beyond the town's edge, the road stretched long and empty, carrying with it the memory of a rider who had come and gone, leaving behind only the echo of a few words that had changed the direction of everything. And somewhere farther still, Ethan Cole rode on, the land opening wide before him, the horizon steady and unbroken, his place in the story already behind him, yet not forgotten, because in Red Hollow, the dust had settled, the street looked the same, the buildings stood as they always had, but the people moved differently now, slower in judgment, quieter in certainty, and though they would never say it out loud, they had learned something that would stay with them longer than any story they had told before, that sometimes the loudest change begins with a man who does not move, and the silence that follows teaches others how to see. Time did not erase what had happened in Red Hollow. It refined it, shaping it into something quieter but harder, something that settled into the way people carried themselves when no one was watching. A week passed, then another, and the memory of that day no longer lived in sharp edges but in small, steady reminders that surfaced when least expected. Clara Whitlock found herself at the edge of town more often, not avoiding it, but choosing when to step into it. Her presence no longer questioned, yet not entirely free from the weight of what had almost been. She walked past the same buildings, the same doors, the same faces. But now those faces held something different, not pity, not fear, but a kind of careful respect that had not existed before, as if each person understood, in their own way, that they had seen her stand through something most would not have endured. The sheriff changed in quieter ways, not through words, not through declarations, but through the choices he made when no one expected him to notice. He listened longer before speaking, asked questions where he once might have assumed, and when disputes rose in town, as they always did, he held them in place a moment longer, giving truth the chance to arrive before judgment. No one pointed it out, but they felt it, the difference in how things were handled. The space he created where once there had been none, near the general store, the old man who had once looked down now greeted Clara with a steady nod each time she passed, not trying to make amends, not seeking forgiveness, just acknowledging her presence as something that mattered. The rider was long gone by then, his path stretching far beyond the horizon, but the echo of his voice remained, carried in the memory of that single sentence that had shifted everything. And Ethan Cole, though unseen in town, was not absent from it, because the place where he had stood had become something more than just a spot in the dust. It had become a measure, an unspoken line that people felt when moments began to lean too far, too fast. One afternoon, a disagreement broke out near the livery, voices rising, tempers edging towards something familiar, something that once would have drawn a crowd. But this time, something different happened. A man stepped forward, not loud, not forceful, simply placing himself between the two others, his stance steady, his voice low, and though he did not say much, the tension shifted, softened, and the moment passed without becoming something more. No one mentioned it afterward, but several people noticed, and they understood without needing to speak it, that the lesson had taken root. Clara watched it from a distance, her expression unchanged, yet her eyes held a quiet recognition of what had just occurred, not because it was dramatic, but because it was not. As the sun dipped low again, casting long shadows across the town, Red Hollow continued on, the same roads, the same dust, the same wind moving through it all, but beneath that sameness lived something new, something earned not through force, but through restraint. And though the man who had stood his ground was no longer there, his choice remained, not as a story told in full, but as a presence felt in the moments when it mattered most, reminding them that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is not step forward, not step back, but simply remain where they are until the truth has room to arrive. There are moments a town remembers not because they were loud, but because they changed what came after. And in Red Hollow that moment had begun to show itself in ways no one had planned. It happened on a morning that felt ordinary enough, the sky pale, the wind steady, the kind of day where nothing important was expected to happen, and that was exactly when it did. A young ranch hand rode in from the West Trail, his horse tired, his face carrying the kind of urgency that usually stirred quick reactions, quick conclusions, the kind that had once defined this place. He spoke of missing tools, of a broken fence line, of someone he believed had passed through during the night. And though his words held no accusation, the tone carried enough edge to draw attention. A few men gathered, listening, exchanging looks, the old pattern beginning to form, subtle but familiar, like footsteps retracing a path worn too many times. Clara Whitlock stood near the well, hearing it all without turning, her hands steady as she drew water, the sound of the bucket against the wood echoing softly. The sheriff approached the group, slower than he might have once, his eyes moving from one face to another, not searching for agreement, but for something else, something that could hold the moment in place. The ranch hand pointed toward the outer road, suggesting who might have passed that way, not naming, but implying, and for a second, just a second, the air tightened again, that same thin line between assumption and truth. Then it happened, not with force, not with command, but with a pause. One of the men who had once stood at the front of the crowd stepped Forward, not loud, not certain, just present. And he spoke a single sentence, measured, careful, asking what had actually been seen, not what had been guessed. The question settled into the group differently then. It would have before, not as a challenge, but as a reminder. Others followed, adding small pieces, asking for details, not rushing to fill the gaps. The sheriff watched it unfold, not stepping in, not taking control, simply allowing the space to remain open long enough for something real to take shape. Clara finally turned then, her gaze moving across the group, not with suspicion, not with expectation, but with quiet observation. And what she saw was not a town free of error, but a town beginning to recognize it. The ranch hand slowed his words, thinking now, recalling what he had actually noticed, not what he had assumed. And in that shift, the tension eased, not gone, but softened into something manageable. The wind moved through the street again, carrying the same dust, the same scent of dry earth, but the feeling beneath it had changed. No one mentioned the day that had taught them this. No one pointed to the space where it had happened, but it was there, in the pause. Before judgment, in the question asked instead of the answer declared. And though the man who had once stood in silence was miles away by now, his choice had stayed behind, not as a story repeated, but as a way of seeing, shaping each moment that followed, quietly, steadily, like something that had always been there, waiting for someone to show them how to use it by the time the season began to shift. When the dry heat softened just enough to let the evenings breathe, Red Hollow had settled into something steadier, something that no longer leaned so quickly toward judgment. And yet no one spoke of it as change, because it did not feel like something new. It felt like something they should have known all along. Clara Whitlock stood at the edge of her field as the sun dipped low, watching the light stretch across the land in long, quiet lines, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her shoulders no longer carrying the same invisible weight. She had not asked for anything from the town, had not demanded understanding or offered explanation. And perhaps that was why what had happened stayed with them, because it had not been forced, it had simply been revealed. Inside town, the sheriff closed his office early that evening, stepping out into the fading light with a slower stride than he once had, pausing near the center of the street where everything had nearly gone wrong. And for a moment, he allowed himself to stand there without purpose, without authority, just a man in a place that had taught him something he had not known he needed to learn. He looked down at the ground, at the dust that had long since shifted and settled, and though there was nothing to mark the spot, he knew exactly where it had been, exactly where a line had been drawn without words. Farther down the street, the same group of men who had once gathered in certainty now worked side by side repairing a section of fencing brought in from the outskirts, their movements quiet, their conversations measured, no longer needing to fill silence with assumption. One of them paused, glancing toward the open space in the center of town, then back to his work, as if reminding himself of something without needing to say it. Clara began the walk back toward her house as the last of the light faded, her steps unhurried, her gaze steady, and as she passed the final row of buildings, she noticed something small, something that might have gone unseen before, a young boy standing by the road, watching her, not with fear, not with curiosity, but with a simple, open look that carried no judgment at all. She gave him a slight nod, and he returned it without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Out beyond the ridge, the land stretched wide and quiet, the same path Ethan Cole had taken days before now empty, yet not untouched, because some choices leave a mark that does not fade with distance. The wind moved gently across the town, brushing against doors, fences, and faces alike, carrying with it no memory of what had been said, only the feeling of what had been learned. And as the first stars appeared above Red Hollow, faint and steady against the darkening sky, the town rested, in a silence that no longer felt heavy, no longer carried tension, but instead held something rare, something earned, the understanding that justice does not always arrive with force or noise. Sometimes it comes quietly, carried by a single man who refuses to step aside, and leaves behind a space where truth can finally be seen years later. When the boards along Red Hollow's main street had been replaced more than once and the wind had carried away the footprints of 1,000 passing days, there remained a space no one could quite explain to a stranger, a place that looked like nothing more than ordinary ground, yet felt different to those who had stood there when it mattered. Clara Whitlock grew older in the quiet way the land teaches, her days marked by seasons rather than events. Her presence no longer questioned, no longer weighed against rumor or fear, but accepted as part of the town itself, as steady and unremarkable as the fence lines she kept mended. She never spoke of that day, not because she had forgotten, but because she understood something others were only beginning to grasp, that the most important moments do not need retelling to remain alive. The sheriff changed as well, not into a different man, but into a more careful one, his decisions slower, his words fewer, his silences longer, and those who came through Red Hollow began to notice it, though they could not say why the place felt different, only that it did. Disputes were settled with more listening than speaking, questions asked before conclusions reached, and in those small shifts, the town became something it had not been before, something closer to what it believed itself to be. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the lights stretched long and thin across the street, a man passing through would ask about the stillness of the place, about the way people seemed to pause just a second longer before answering. And someone would gesture vaguely toward the center of town without offering a story, because the truth did not live in words anymore. It lived in the habit that had formed afterward, far beyond the edges of Red Hollow, where the land opened wide and the horizon held no memory of towns or names. Ethan Cole continued on the same way he always had, moving from one stretch of ground to another, his life measured in miles rather than moments, never returning, never asking what became of the place he left behind. Yet in a way that mattered more than presence, he remained, not as a figure people spoke of, not as a name carved into memory, but as a choice that had been seen once and understood slowly. Because out there, where the wind moves without asking and the dust settles without keeping score, a man can leave without knowing what he is given. But in Red Hollow, they carried it forward in ways he would never witness. And so the town endured, not perfect, not without error, but changed in the quiet spaces where it counted, where a voice might rise too quickly and then stop, where a step forward might be taken and then held, where a line might be drawn not with force, but with presence. And if you stood there long enough, in that ordinary patch of ground beneath a wide and patient sky, you might feel it, not as a story, not as a lesson spoken aloud, but as something steadier than both, the understanding that out here, justice does not always ride in with noise or leave behind a mark you can see. Sometimes it stands still, says nothing, and waits until the world remembers how to listen.